I think it's a very important occasion for us in terms of listening to you. You have been a scholar who have traveled extensively all across China several times, and have also represented the government of India on several occasions during Ms. Swaraj's time and subsequently as well. I'm sure it's only since the COVID you haven't been visiting China, but otherwise your expertise is and the domain knowledge that you have is something that's immense, and would love to listen to you and then probably question answer session itself. Now, as the topic demands, last week we have had Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, we have had Lieutenant General Narasimhan, and then also Srikanth Kundapalli deliberating on. But at the same time, this is a lecture that was supposed to happen before that, but then unfortunately because of certain other commitments, it has to happen now. I'll request my colleague Dr. Anand to introduce Dr. Parulekar to the audience.
Good morning, audience. I will just make an attempt to introduce you to Dr. Dattesh. Dr. Dattesh, as Dr. Nankishore has said, he's a big friend of the department ever since its inception. We have been in touch with him, and we have been the beneficiary of a lot of insights. He has interesting insights, I should say, about international politics in general, and his own specific area of Latin America as well as on China. So Dr. Dattesh D. Parulekar is Assistant Professor of International Relations and Strategic Studies at the School of International and Area Studies in Goa University. His areas of specialization include India's foreign policy and diplomacy, Chinese political economy, strategic maritime affairs with respect to the Indo-Pacific, besides area studies expertise on conflict issues in Africa and the political economy of Latin America. Formerly a Fulbright Research Fellow, he undertook a crucial segment of his doctoral research work at the Conflict Management Center School of Advanced International Studies in Johns Hopkins University, Washington, D.C. He is a visiting fellow, regularly lecturing at NWC, INS Mandovi, at the DSSC Wellington, and the INA Elimala, as also the AWC in Mao. Besides, he is academically and professionally affiliated with think tanks and public universities across South Asia, Europe, Latin America. Besides multiple institutions in China, he is also integrally associated with nationalist-minded think tanks like India Foundation in New Delhi and the Forum for Integrated National Security Studies. He writes opinion op-ed pieces for RIAC Moscow, ISDP in Sweden, China Daily, etc. Besides publishing peer-reviewed articles in national and international academic journals. So I once again warmly welcome Dr. Dattesh virtually for this special lecture of his. And Dr. Dattesh, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Am I perfectly audible?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you first to the Department of Geopolitics and IR, in particular Dr. Nand Kishore, who is he's a very dear friend and also a very professionally esteemed colleague. Also, thank you to Dr. Anand and the entire department. As you rightly said, it's been many years since I've gone back to a platform at Manipal, albeit virtual. But it's been a long association and something that I'm very fond of and I covet going forward. So let me quickly get to the topic at hand. And the topic really is about perceptions and misperceptions in Sino-Indian relations. Now let's try and understand the context for this, because this could anyway be a kind of a generic theme that we could discuss at any point in time. But why are we particularly trying to home in on this particular theme at this point in time? And that's because if you look at what has happened over the last decade or so, and I would not just put it in the context of the pandemic and a kind of potential post-pandemic world, the world has essentially moved into a certain axis. And that axis is not about just how much of comprehensive national power you amass or accumulate, and where exactly on the pecking order in terms of global power sweepstakes you are, but it's really about what you do with that power. There are many countries in the world which can be described as rising powers, emerging powers. You can have different sobriquets to kind of define them. But ultimately, what distinguishes one power from another is what does it do with that comprehensive national power or that capacity that it tends to build. How do you wield that particular power? How do you strategically leverage that particular power? And in strategically leveraging and wielding that power, are you seen as a responsible actor on the world stage, or are you seen as an irresponsible actor on the world stage? So the profile of a country in terms of power is important, but what profile you exude by your actions is as important, if not more important, than the power you repose. And I think that is where we need to look at India and China and try and understand the perceptions and misperceptions that emerge from what is really a very complex relationship. Quite often people summarily describe this relationship and say it's a relationship which is impacted by the baggage of history. Now that's true, but then that's also the case with Pakistan. Our relationship with Pakistan is also impacted by the baggage of history. But would we put an India-Pakistan relationship at the same level of complexity as an India-China relationship? Obviously not. Because in the case of an India-Pakistan relationship, it's really in many senses what we in English call the one-trick pony. Because for Pakistan, it is essentially Kashmir and the creation of Pakistan and how it looks at India. That's all that matters to Pakistan, and that is what we are contending with. But when it comes to China, are we contending with simply one particular issue that is, let's say, a dispute between our two countries? Is it simply a case of, let's say, the border dispute, although the border dispute is arguably the most critical dispute in our equations? But is the relationship essentially distilled down to only the border? Which is to say, if we were to resolve the border at some point in time, is the India-China competition, elements of conflict, level of distrust going to go away essentially? I, for one, would have a hypothesis, no, it won't. It may improve the situation, but it won't go away. And that's why I would say that the India-China relationship is a complex one because it is impacted by the baggage of history. It is in many ways impacted also by the immutability of geography, which is what we share, both in terms of being two large contiguous neighbors, but also sharing an overlapping neighborhood and extended periphery. But we are also shaped by the power asymmetry. And there is a very clear power asymmetry which is there for all to see, which is obviously in favor of China. But what will essentially continue to make this relationship complex is the manner in which capacities of China and India will be transformed into capabilities. And that is where these next 10 or 20 years is going to be extremely critical. Because if it was only a case of how much power you hold, China literally is streets ahead of India. But that does not necessarily mean that the relationship is going to remain in an asymmetric syndrome forever. Because as capacities turn into capabilities, the ability of India and the ability of China to be able to transform their comprehensive national power and become alternatives is going to define this relationship. And that's why if you look at India and China, we are not just two civilizations which have interacted for 2000 years. I mean, we kind of rubbish it and say, look, these are two civilizations. There is a natural logic for us to work together. Absolutely. But then if we are two civilizations which have interacted, just look at the quotient of people to people ties. Does it even reflect that kind of civilizational antecedents? Because people to people contact between the two countries is quite minimal. I mean, for two large countries which are neighbors of one another, which have been acquainted for 2000 years, the people-to-people contact should have been much higher. But you only have to travel around China and meet people and just try and sense as to what they make of what you are, which is effectively Hindu, as they would say. Oh, you are an Hindu, right? And how do they understand what is an Hindu? Do they have a sense of the fact that India has arrived on the world stage and is one of the 3 countries that is going to define this particular century? Are they aware of the sterling achievements that India has made in a whole host of sectors over the last 20, 25 years? They're in fact clueless. They look at India still as a country that exported Buddhism to China. And they look at India as a society, a civilization, a democracy that is emerging. But they don't have a true sense of where India is. And even though we tend to be very obsessed about China in our public discourse, I mean, from morning to night, we are discussing China whenever we are discussing politics, international politics. Do Indian people also have enough of an understanding of what exactly is going on in China? So we are often 2 societies that are interacting through the prism of stereotypes. And that obviously is going to create certain perceptions which are real, but certain perceptions which are also not so real. But actually, India and China are 2 systems which are alternatives to each other. And that is where the misperception index has to be debated. While India may still be a laggard in terms of comprehensive national power vis-a-vis China, the very fact that India and China are so different to each other in terms of their political systems, they are so different to each other in the way in which their economic milieus operate, they are so different in terms of how their societies are conditioned. It is this distinctness between India and China, which are like 2 lines that can never blur. They're 2 lines that can never meet. It is this that is going to define a qualitative change between India and China. So regardless of where India stands on the power index, India's democracy and qualitative difference to China is going to make India a worthy competitor and a worthy alternative to China, first, of course, in Asia, and then, of course, globally. And although China may not accept this, this is what makes China uneasy. For example, let's just take a couple of indicators, which I wanted to point out as we look at the situation going forward. In 2014, when Prime Minister Modi took over, and I had the opportunity of visiting just a few months later, because I was invited, in fact, to preview what would be the thinking and the thought process, both of Prime Minister Modi and his government, basically the BJP strategic outlook, but also because the Chinese were looking to understand what is the RSS's worldview, knowing fully well that this was a strong government which had come with a resounding majority, and they had their own senses that this government was here to stay for an extended period of time. So they were quite pragmatic to want to know exactly whether the RSS still sees China only from the prism of 1962, or is there a post-62 way of also looking at how to engage China? And at that time, a couple of things struck me. In my discourses across different different cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and including when I went to Hainan, there were 2 things that came to mind. The first was the Chinese increasingly telling me that what they understand of Prime Minister Modi is basically India having found their Deng Xiaoping. And they began to tell me that probably this is going to be the start of your bold reform process. This is going to be the start of this kind of fundamental change that India needs, which puts India beyond being just a South Asian power and puts it on the global sweepstakes, if not the Asian sweepstakes. So they were beginning to look at Prime Minister Modi and his persona, and therefore India, very differently from what it did before 2014. And this is even before Prime Minister Modi had done much as Prime Minister. But over time, in the next couple of years, on both sides of the aisle, there was this belief that with President Xi and Prime Minister Modi being strong leaders in their respective countries, deeply popular, deeply admired, of course, for different reasons, and very charismatic, that these 2 nationalist-minded leaders, having resounding popularity and resounding support of their people, may actually be able to find the grand bargain between India and China. Because if the India-China dispute or the India-China issue has to be resolved, it will require bold leadership. And the feeling was that these were the 2 leaders who could deliver on that kind of bold agreement, if anybody ever could. What has happened now? Just look how the narrative changes because perceptions change also. From 2015 and 2016, when there was a sense of optimism that these two leaders could strike a rapport and that could help in terms of India-China relations, in the wake of what happened in Galwan last year and the prolonged phase of freeze that we see now in relations, there is a sense of, if I may say, despondency that probably under these two leaders now, both of whom are going to stand for their respective national interest without any compromise, that we could actually be entering a very prolonged phase when India-China relations could actually remain in a kind of a downturn phase. So perceptions have changed within just 4 years. So what really has happened? We also have to understand that when you look at the whole Chinese-India story, the fundamental point is China's unease with India's rise and not necessarily with the power of India's rise. It is the profile of India's rise that kind of makes China uneasy, because let's accept it. While China may have developed themselves in terms of material capacity and are making an impact on the world stage, post the Galwan crisis and since the pandemic, China has only shown itself to be a ruthless exponent and not a responsible stakeholder. And let me give you a couple of examples to tell you what does it mean. It's very interesting that since the pandemic began to surge last year, China tried to occupy the vacuum that was created by certain distraction caused to leaderships around the world as they were fighting the pandemic to heighten militarized conflicts with their neighbors. There was a little bit of a brush with Japan, there was a brush with Vietnam, there was a brush with Indonesia, there was a war of words, of course, an escalated war of words with Australia, and of course the ongoing issue with the US. But the only place where this conflict really ended up in a brutal fashion was with India. So in a sense, India was picked out and chosen for a conflict that goes beyond normal gradations of escalation. The Senkaku issue with Japan has been long-standing, but that did not explode in the wake of the pandemic. The only country with which a full-blown conflict, albeit a limited one, a limited brush happened for the first time in 45 years was with India. So there was a certain messaging that was being delivered, and that messaging comes with the unease with India's rise. But equally, it's very interesting that since Galwan happened, India has taken a series of steps to tell China that you are no longer a stakeholder in the India growth story, that we can't accept you as an economic partner if you continue to behave in the adversarial manner that you do with regard to other issues. We have gone so far as even to very clearly indicate now that Huawei is out of the 5G race as far as India is concerned. But has China retaliated economically on India? And that's the dichotomy I want to present to you. So it's very fascinating. Why did China choose India for a military brush, yet China has staved off or has held off on economic retaliatory measures? And I'm saying this with full confidence because we all know how Ambassador Vikram Misri was called to the Foreign Office in Beijing 2 years ago. And he was told very clearly that if Huawei was put out of the 5G race in India, which China believed was unethical and wrong, that they would in fact take retaliatory steps against India's tech companies and service sector companies which are operating in China. It's been months now since we have made it very clear that Huawei is not part of the 5G race, but we have not seen China retaliate so far. So while they continue to remain militarily entrenched in Eastern Ladakh and across the Western sector, they have not taken the kind of economic steps of retaliation against India. So what does it suggest? Does it suggest a kind of a confused perception about India? Or it probably just is basically balancing principle in one place and pragmatism in the other? The fundamental problem, and this is something that I also once again want to indicate, is China's messaging about India that it has internalized and processed through successive leaderships leading up to 2014. When Chinese presidents would visit India, it would always be as part of a 2 or a 3 nation trip, which included smaller South Asian neighbors. Now, we all understand in terms of diplomatic parlance that if you really want to give importance to a particular country, and that country expects you to give that importance, then that particular visit must be a standalone visit. We all remember how India nudged Crown Prince Salman not to come straight from Islamabad to Delhi, just because it would look like a visit to Pakistan and India. So he went back all the way back, and then a few days later came back to India, because India wanted, and also Saudi Arabia realized that it was important to give that impression that this was a standalone visit between two partners that see themselves as strategic partners in the right frame. And yet, all along till 2014, including in 2014, Xi Jinping and earlier presidents traveled to India and made it look like a 2 or a 3 country visit, thereby giving the messaging that for China, India was not even an Asian power, but India actually was a subcontinental or a South Asian power. That they just saw them as the big daddy amongst all the other South Asian countries. And that is a clear indication that I don't acknowledge you as a worthy Asian power, leave alone acknowledging you as a co-equal. In 2015, when Prime Minister Modi went to China, a similar signal was given to China, a kind of tit-for-tat signal, when an Indian Prime Minister chose not to make a standalone visit to China, and that was, I think, a very good messaging, but it began with Mongolia, it moved on to China and went along to South Korea, and therefore telling China that, look, now is the time where there will be tit-for-tat measures. If you want to have a relationship with India, that relationship is going to have to be based on the time-tested and time-honored tradition of the principle of reciprocity. If there is no reciprocity in every form, then India also will not hesitate from reciprocating in equal measure. And we've seen how that has now contributed to a changed perception even in China about Prime Minister Modi and the Modi government. But the fact remains, you can't overcome your deficits in capacities overnight. The point is, China does not acknowledge India as a co-equal, but quite clearly in qualitative terms, India being the democracy that is coveted by most of the world, and we've seen in the last few years how India has really become a choiced, privileged partner for most Western economies and Western democracies, while China in many ways still remains the partner of compulsion. I mean, I for one would not go around talking about China isolation theory, because I think that is just hollow patriotism that does no service to any of us. The hypothesis of a China isolation theory, I think, is dead. In a world of complex interdependence, you can't isolate the second largest economy of the world. You can't isolate a country that has really almost become a global superpower. You can't isolate a country which the United States itself has declared as the most formidable military power over the next 10 years. And clearly, as you can see in the latest military report that has come out, they have made it very clear that by 2049, the Americans acknowledge that the Chinese are probably going to have global military dominance. So you don't isolate a country like this, not in a complexly interdependent world that we have today. But it's equally clear that this heady optimism of facilitating China's rise has gone away. And that is now being counteracted through a deepening engagement with India. So while all along the theory used to be, and this was again something that China also would talk about, they would say, look, India for us is just a Western prop. I mean, like, for example, Israel was seen by much of the Arab world for a long time as a colonial outpost of the West. You know, the Chinese thinking on India was, and they would say this to you, informally, they would say to you, we see you as a kind of a colonial prop or a Western prop against us. As if to say India on its own could not deliver, that the West looks at India as essentially a counterweight to China, and that is why they would prop you up. But today, if you see the deepening engagement, and if you look at the content and configuration of the engagement that India has with a lot of Western democracies across the board, I'm not just talking of the Indo-Pacific, but across the Indo-Pacific and beyond, there is a sense that India is no longer just a counterweight, that India truly is being appreciated as the alternative to China. And an alternative in qualitative terms is much more than just being a counterweight. A counterweight is when you just want to balance off. But this is not an engagement to balance off. This is an engagement to create a situation where democracies can prevail over autocracies. So this is the fault line that is now emerging. It's not about China's GDP versus India's GDP. It's not about China's per capita income versus India's per capita income. It's about Chinese authoritarianism and what it brings to the table across a huge range of strategic portfolios versus India's democracy, India's democratic way of functioning. And that's why what India brings to the table in terms of developing alternatives in these strategic portfolios. There's another important point that has to be understood in the perception misperception game. And that's about the worldview of China and India. For quite some time, China would make the argument that, we should work together with India because we are developing nations, and they would always try to make common cause with them. But in reality, if you look at the Tianxia of China and the outlook or the kind of worldview of India, I think it has fundamental differences. In fact, here I would even go so far as to say that China and the United States both are united by a sense of intoxicating exceptionalism. Every civilized country has a right to think of itself as exceptional. We also believe that there is a certain exceptional quality that Indian civilization has. But that exceptional nature of Indian civilization doesn't lead us to create a hegemonic sphere of influence. We are not trying to impose our civilizational solutions on our neighbors and say, this is the way you ought to go. In fact, that is why we have defined our understanding of the broader, interaction as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And if you see, the best exemplary definition of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is in this unfortunate time of the pandemic, where after the first wave, which India weathered quite well, when India had the initial doses of vaccines ready, we were able to spread these vaccines to as many as 100 countries of the world in varying degrees. And yet, when the second wave struck, of course, when we gave all these vaccines, we gave a lot of medicine, we gave a lot of equipment to big countries, middle countries, small countries, all kinds of countries. And yet, when the second wave struck and we were short of supplies, we had no qualms, we had no compunctions in saying that we will take help from the smallest country in the world also. It did not hurt our ego, because our ego is not founded on the fact that we know it all. In fact, what did we say? And what was being said by those countries? Even the smallest country, let's say from the South Pacific, in fact, Fiji. I mean, imagine Fiji giving us aid, but we took that aid. We didn't say, oh, who is Fiji to give us aid, right? I mean, Fiji is a small country. No, it's not about that. It's not about small and big. It's not about hegemony. We see the world as Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one universe. And like we say in a family, sometimes somebody has to help the other person, and sometimes the shoe is on the other foot. Each one has to help out each other. And so we were extremely proud by the fact that all these countries who offered us aid, they said what? We are offering aid back to India in return because India offered us aid when we needed it. Now, if let's say China were to suffer a major catastrophe, I mean, let's accept it. Let's say half of China goes into catastrophe. And if tomorrow, let's say a Fiji steps up and says, we want to provide some aid to China, do you think China will accept it? Number one. Secondly, will it acknowledge that this aid has been offered to it, and it's even considering it? It would brush it aside, probably even bristle at the thought that how dare a country like Fiji provide us aid. That's the difference between the Chinese version of exceptionalism, which is couched in these theories of win-win outcomes and common development and joint prosperity, but actually is a hegemonic exceptionalism. Let me give one more example. Ambassador Gang, who is now their ambassador right now in Washington, he's just commented 2 days ago in response to Joe Biden observing that China made a big mistake by not going to the COP26. And what was his statement? If you read his entire statement, it's very interesting. It typifies Chinese perceptions of the world and also then of India. It tries to make common cause by saying China, America has to make disproportionately large sacrifices because the developing world is hampered by America's hypocrisy. It says America should provide a lot of financial aid on the issue of climate to be able to create sustainable pathways for developing countries, but does not say that although China is part of the developing world, as they keep arguing, that China will take any of this aid from the United States. So China makes two arguments which are concurrent. One, that we are a vox populi, we are a spokesperson for the developing world. We have the best intentions for the developing world. We have their best intentions at heart. Yet, for the purpose of receiving aid from the West, we are no developing country. So they want to ply both boats. And that's a very interesting combination. So they try to give competing messages at the same time. And in this, their tendency is to see India as a developing country, period. Whereas to see themselves as a developing country that has also reached levels of development. So they will turn around the Chinese and often say this. Why don't you have your own technological platforms? Why are you so dependent on Western technological platforms? And then they will turn around and say, look, we have our own alternatives to social media platforms, which is why the international social media can't dictate terms to us. On data privacy, we have our own autonomy because we've been able to create that autonomy. Whereas you've allowed your data essentially to be mined by social media platforms. And today, essentially, you are having to recreate new platforms. So they will present India's engagement with the West as India's dependence on the West, and then draw that distinction with themselves to say, our rise may have been facilitated by the West, but we are not dependent on the West. You know, this is the distinction in perception. If you look at most of the documents and the commentaries that come out when India and China's leaders engage, and this is all the way through from the principles at the high level segment all the way down, you see a characteristic mention that is unique to India and China. In every joint statement or joint communique, you will see words or phrases like strategic guidance, strategic communication, coordination for win-win outcomes. And this tells you very clearly that perceptions and misperceptions are rife in this relationship. Take an Indo-US joint statement. You won't find talk about we need to establish strategic communication. Because I think in 2 decades, India's US relationship has gone from being a natural alliance or natural allies to now being global strategic partners. But with China, the problem is not productivizing the relationship. It is first stabilizing the relationship. Because only if you have a modicum of stability, which some would describe as equilibrium, only then you can think of productivity in that relationship. And all the time, the recurrent word that you keep hearing is strategic level of trust that needs to be established. Now, it's very clear, back in 2005, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh made a statement. And at that time, he said that Asia and the world is large enough to accommodate the interests, the aspirations, and the ambitions of both China and India, including in Asia. This was India's formulation of how it saw accommodation with China, that both of us could find accommodation, both of us would engage each other in an element of reciprocity, in an element of equanimity. But if you look at what has transpired since 2005 in particular, all the way till 2021, does it really indicate that both of us are on the same page? Or are we singing from different hymn sheets? Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who spoke about the fact that Asia is large enough to accommodate both India and China. But have we asked China whether they really believe in accommodation with India? Because if that be the case, then the series of steps they have taken, whether it is the Belt and Road Initiative and the CPEC alignment in particular, whether it's the strategic encirclement of India that we have seen from the early 2000s in terms of the maritime strategy. If you look at Chinese actions in terms of our overlapping peripheries, particularly in continental domain, which is the Himalayan and the peninsular South Asia. If you look at all of that, the indication is that it is not accommodation. It is essentially co-option to Chinese interest. And it's very funny that the Chinese will turn around, and this is again something that they would say. They've always asked this question, when you appear there. Why is it that the Indian government is so anti-BRI? And they will always ask, why can't you really balance principle with pragmatism? So the argument the Chinese make is, look at us and Japan. We hate Japan. We have an animus with Japan that is never going to go away. But don't we do huge amount of trade with Japan? We do. It's $400 billion. It's 4 times still the trade that India and China does. So this is one example they raise. They raise an even fundamental example. Look at China and Taiwan, the mainland and Taiwan. We have issues with Taiwan, but has it stopped us from interacting with people on the island? Has it stopped us from doing trade on the island? So the argument they make with India is, are you only going to be steeped in ideological thinking, which is going to keep the relationship in this rut? Or are you also willing to take a leaf out of our book and balance principle and pragmatism? Now, this is very easy to say, but the point is you can flip the argument and say, just as China has the right to establish red lines, India also has the right to establish red lines and expect that those red lines are respected. Would China accept if Taiwan were to be inducted, let's say, into the comprehensive or the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is something that is right now being discussed? If, let's say, Taiwan's candidature for the CPTPP were to be accepted, will China just take it lying down and say it's economic pragmatism? Or would it believe that a red line has been crossed? I'm not going even back into the one China policy and overturning that. That is still a big issue. But let's say tomorrow India were to say we are reconsidering the one China policy. Is China willing to then balance principle with pragmatism? I mean, at the drop of a hat, China looks to weaponize instruments against other countries. So why would India countenance a CPEC alignment that goes through Pakistan occupied Kashmir, in which China has no business to be there? And if at all, that is a dispute between India and Pakistan. So this is clear that even though they would like to make this heretical argument of principle versus pragmatism, it is basically a very selective argument to say, we want to co-opt you and accommodate your interests subject to our acceptance. So that's not a way in which you actually accommodate. But let's also understand, we have to look at the perceptions of China from a different complex. We all know China has a land border with 14 countries, and they've pretty much resolved it with almost all. I mean, basically with almost all. I mean, even those with whom they have issues don't really go out and, stake their neck out on those issues. So they remain mum about it, like with Central Asia. But with almost every country barring India, the border pretty much is settled. Now, what does that mean? That means two things. One, the India-China border issue is truly an intractable issue, very difficult to resolve. Or two, one of the parties, in this case probably China, has no real genuine interest of resolving the border, hoping that they'll be able to impose a solution of India at some point in time if the power index between India and China were to widen than what it is right now. But if we were to take a very close and nuanced look, China takes different instrumentalities with regard to different border approaches. Its approach in the ECS and the SCS, which is the maritime domain, is so very different to its approach with regard to the lower Mekong countries. And I'm talking essentially of the countries right away from Myanmar all the way out to Vietnam, which is the lower Mekong. So if you look at the approach that China takes to borders or peripheries which are on land as opposed to maritime, they can be very different. In the case of the SCS and the ECS, it's about military encroachments, fortification, salami slicing, incremental aggression, and then essentially talking of historical claims. But they're not doing any of this when it comes to land and when it comes to the Mekong countries, where they continue to push things like Langchang Mekong Corridor. They keep pushing trans-boundary cooperation projects. They look to ensnare these countries into debt diplomacy, but by giving a very benign approach of China. And then they have a third approach, which is a stress-building approach in Himalayan South Asia. So for example, what they are doing with Nepal, what they are doing now with Bhutan, of course, with the recent news that has come out that Bhutan and China would probably enter into discussions to begin with. It's clearly building stresses on India's continental periphery. So the perceptions are very different for China when it comes to different border approaches. Is there a level of strategic trust, or can there be a level of strategic trust? Now let's look at a simple question. Closer to each other's borders, building trust will take a lot of time, because when issues are aggravating, the trust level also is going to be very diminished and it's going to take time. But if there was any hope on the horizon, it would have been visible if India and China, say, per se, would have been able to build any kind of trust in areas further away from their border. And I'm pointing this out, what happened in 2019 when Prime Minister Modi went for the informal summit to Wuhan. What did they agree? They agreed there that at least they would start off by doing some joint projects in Afghanistan. That if India and China were to able to build certain initiatives jointly in Afghanistan, then that would create a sense of, a kind of a good environment, a kind of a goodwill situation, which may then translate into other issues. Although I'm not equating India's border with China with cooperation in Afghanistan, but that was the sense. What happened even to cooperation in Afghanistan? Nothing came of it. Go back to 2006, when a certain Mani Shankar Iyer was then the petroleum minister in a UPA government. That time the UPA government was very heady on this whole argument that India and China can go jointly out and bid for oil blocks. That there would be a joint energy collaboration partnership. Rather than compete with each other, we would actually not outdo each other, but actually work together to be able to source oil. It did not take more than 6 to 8 months for that initiative to fall flat. So it clearly tells you that even on issues where probably the interests coincide, the intentions don't. And that's why it's very difficult to see how this level of trust can be built in a post-Galwan scenario, closer to home, where the issues are so very, very intense. I had mentioned to you in the early part of my lecture about what I called as the immutability of geography, where geography is unchangeable. We always say that, right? We say, you can change your history, but you can't change your neighbors. Geography is geography. You are given a certain geography and you have to work within that. But the problem is, while the continental geography between India and China has become immutable now, at least for the last 7 decades after the annexation of Tibet, China has reconfigured what it understands as geography of India. And that is India's biggest challenge. So perception and misperception management is not only about the continental domain. Increasingly, it's going to be all around India, including in the maritime domain, including in the connectivity domain, including in the technological domain. In every strategic realm or every strategic portfolio, there will have to be a separate trust building exercise. Perceptions cannot be universal across the board because China does not see India as a monolith, and India would do well not to see the Chinese Communist Party also as a monolith. This is one of the mistakes that many in India would do. In fact, that's why we would keep saying, for example, just last year, we kept hearing that President Xi Jinping has bitten off more than he can chew. He's taken on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, all at the same time. And this is going to really lead to a collapse of China very soon. Where is Hong Kong today in terms of discussion? It's gone off the debate. Where is Xinjiang? It's gone off the debate. It just seems to come up every few months for a week or two and then disappears. And the fear is just like Tibet, which honestly should have been a much larger issue. But you know what's happened to Tibet. It remains an issue that keeps sputtering every now and then. Similarly, these issues also are not going to unnerve or not going to make China uneasy. And that's why we have to understand that China is not the homogeneous monolith that we think they are. The Chinese system has shown itself to be much more agile than we actually give it credit for. Another important point is the issue of strategic autonomy. Now, this is understood differently. For us, strategic autonomy is a cardinal tenet of our foreign policy because we believe that we are not supplicants of any large power, that India has its own worldview and India is willing to exercise and articulate that worldview with confidence. So when India's partners in the Indo-Pacific, namely Japan, Australia, and the US, subscribed to a free and open Indo-Pacific, Prime Minister Modi went to Shangri-La in Singapore and added another I to it, calling it the free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Now, this I, adding of this I, was not just a case of changing the acronym. It was a belief that India does not want to get into reductionist games of containment, but we will stand up for rules of the international maritime order to be upheld. This was a very balanced and a very principled argument. In fact, India has shown at different points in time, not only now, but since 2002, that even though it can build a mutually beneficial and productive relationship with the United States, it can at times very politely but forthrightly stand up to the United States and say, this far and no further. I'm sure some of us, particularly the faculty here that is here, would be aware of the Proliferation Security Initiative that was proposed by President Bush in 2002, where American Navy could interdict ships in the high seas, and they wanted India to be part of this kind of an initiative. India said, unless this initiative is blessed formally by the United Nations, India will not be party to any such measures because these will invite countermeasures from other countries. This goes against international law. But we stood up with the same President Bush in Krakow in 2004, when we announced jointly what is called as the Community of Democracies, which has now flourished and become a very important collective within the UN. Similarly, we have recently, been at bones and been at pains to stress that no matter what the pressure over Katsa, we will continue with our acquisition of the S-400 from Russia. So we have at different, and this is again that comes up with the Chinese, who will keep saying, you're just being propped up by the United States. You seem to go in tandem with the United States all the time. But that's not true. These are misperceptions. Probably these are deliberate misperceptions to be able to make their argument look legitimate. So for India, India's strategic autonomy does not mean a kind of reflexive anti-approach to any country, but it actually means an approach that puts India first. The last point that I will make before I stop, China takes a historical long view, and it looks at various countries from its historical prism. But the point is, while it looks at India, the main difference is it seems to think that India wants to somehow continue engaging with colonial powers, that India has not come out of its colonial hangover. If you look at China, they detest and resent colonial powers, and they're making every effort to try and indicate that they will stand up to those powers. So for example, even the G20 now, there are some initial signs that the G20 could be weakening, because you are seeing that as the G20 strengthens, the Chinese and the Russians now are beginning to be selective about which G20 meeting to attend and in what format and how. So when the G20 convened in an emergency summit on Afghanistan, China and Russia stayed away. And this time they also chose to address it virtually. So it's very clear that China now has taken the step that they've reached a certain level of critical power and criticality where they will be willing to strike out on their own and be willing to even go against the established structures that we have today. And the argument that they keep making with regard to India is that India does not stress enough of this differentiation, that India wants to engage. But that's where the perceptions are so different, because for China, everything is zero sum. Whereas for India, in the words of Dr. S. Jaishankar, who recently about 18 months ago said this, that India is a Southwest power. So the argument that we make to China is, we don't see the world in terms of ideologies as you're beginning to do it, because you're putting everything in the context of the Cold War now. We actually see it in the context of India being a Southwest power. We are a strong country in the global South, but we also have the capacity today, because of our acceptability, our legitimacy as a vibrant democracy, as a country which is emerging in various fields and spheres of human influence. We are now in a position to look to bridge the differences between the West and the South. And that's why the participation of Prime Minister Modi at COP26, was very important, because although one may quibble and one may doubt on what India's commitments are, the manner in which India was able to join with the UK, join with other countries to be able to put new mechanisms in place shows that India is here as a bridging power. India is not here as a wedging power. So as China emerges, China's emergence, China's strategic ascendant rise is wedging the world. The belief is that India's glacial emergence, we're not strategically ascendant, we are glacially emergent, but we are emergent, will actually lead to India being a bridging power, and the world's approaches becoming more convergent. I think I'll stop here for now, and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dattesh, for that very articulate, very clear presentation about perceptions and misperceptions of India, of China, towards China, and from the Chinese side towards India. I think this has given a very clear picture towards the students, but nevertheless, I am sure they'll be having some questions regarding this. So we'll pass on to the Q&A stage of this lecture, where we'll see the questions which the students are coming up with, and you can hopefully address them. So yes, students, any questions? Those online, they can raise their hands. Yes, Avisha, can you just, you can come here. Okay.
So I just wanted to ask, so we were talking about how China is trying to realize, I mean, sort of realizing power, but throughout history, we've seen how rising powers like the US, Russia, whenever there is this transitional phase and they're rising, you see them build alliances, you see them build blocks, you see them spread over a larger area. But when you look at China and the rising powers, you see that they don't want to build alliances. They want to, even in their periphery, they're sort of adversarial towards everybody. So what sort of a rise is this where it's complete opposite of what history is witnessed?
Okay. So Avisha here has a question. Since all the major powers, they have alliances, why is China not having a proper alliance of sorts? It is surrounded by enemies. What kind of a new great power is this? That is her question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because till today the alliance frameworks that we have been inured to have been essentially the ones which the West has been able to create. So when we look at alliances, we still look at them largely in terms of security and military components or military alignments. And the most recent being, of course, AUKUS, which has stirred a hornet's nest. But we live in a complex, interdependent world where this word alliances is also going to undergo a metamorphosis. Because what does an alliance mean? An alliance essentially means a meeting of minds. It means a certain symbiosis of processes and institutions between countries. It means a level of synergization between countries where there is hardly any daylight between them. Now, that can be achieved today without actually becoming alliances in the conventional scope. So China's alliances are essentially trade-based. China's alliances are essentially infrastructure connectivity-based, because China's whole view of alliances is about ensuring not just the centrality of China, but the centricity of China. And that is important. Because while many countries aspire for centrality in world affairs, like we say it's a US-centric system, and we've said the neoliberal economic order is a US-centric system, in China's case, they don't want just a centrality of China, they want a centricity of China. And in their understanding of centricity, it is a whole of systems approach as to how to essentially synergize with countries. So when Huawei is able to spread its wings far and wide across many countries and take technological control over these countries, that's probably stronger than any conventional alliance can ever aspire to be. When China is able to build infrastructure connectivity pathways that brings country into their sphere of influence in an irreversible manner, that is stronger than any alliance that can ever be propounded by the West. So my contention here is we must look at alliances in their concept and their discourse very differently in today's world, because in today's world, which is complexly interdependent and interconnected, strategic portfolios have their own lexicon of what alliances mean. A technological alliance is very different to a military alliance. An economic alliance is very different. For example, the RCEP. I mean, just look at the RCEP. The RCEP was not a Chinese baby, but today it is basically being propounded as a Chinese initiative. because China's disproportionate economic influence is going to ensure that probably a decade down the line, China will essentially treat this as a multilateral economic alliance with a very vibrant part of the world. So this would be my contention in terms of alliances.
Thank you, Dr. Dattesh. Questions? Anyone? Yes, Malavika?
I wanted to ask about China and India relations. Are they as important as India is India, or do they not play that important a role in China?
With respect to India? Or?
No,
Sorry.
I mean, with
Yeah.
respect to, with respect to China's rise in general, the way processions are affected.
Yeah, basically how here Malavika, second year student, she wants to know about DPRK, where North Korea is situated in it, how it basically impacts China's image and the perception of about China.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the traditional relationship between North Korea and China, China was not the initial preferred partner, it was always the Soviet Union. And then as times changed, obviously China came into the reckoning. But if you see lately what China has done, China continues to basically use two approaches. One is it continues to use the North Korean ballistic missile brinkmanship, which one is very clear happens with the blessings of Beijing. It uses this brinkmanship as a bargaining chip to keep countries, including the US, constantly engaged with it as a potential interlocutor. But lately, it has also begun to realize that it cannot be seen as only a backer of North Korea. And that's why the intensification of China's relations with South Korea, for instance, the manner in which Xi Jinping has been reaching out to South Korea and building a relationship with South Korea, such that South Korea refused to blame China and has continued to refuse to blame China. Even in a summit meeting with the United States, they have said we are not going to be part of any kind of engagement that is even remotely seen as anti-China, is an indication of how China sees the Korean Peninsula. So China sees the Korean Peninsula as a theater that needs stability. For that stability, it needs two arch pillars. The one arch pillar is to keep this issue of the nuclear overhang constantly engaged in public discourse, because that remains a leverage on Washington and on Japan and on South Korea. But by building links with South Korea, they're also creating sufficient leverage for them to be able to be a greater participant in an ultimate negotiated compromise between the two Koreas. Because at some point in time, if the two Koreas were to normalize in whatever form they decide so, the whole argument of China is they would like to be the central actor and not the United States. If China only plays footsie through the six-party framework, which has till today been the framework, which is the US-driven framework, then the US has primacy in the event of a negotiated settlement. For China, a negotiated settlement must be one where it remains the salient actor, and that can only happen if it balances its relations through continued brinkmanship of North Korea, but also through beneficial and mutually beneficial engagement with South Korea, and of course, by extension with Japan.
Thank you, Dr. Dattesh. Madhuvanti here has a question. Madhuvanti? Madhuvanti, we can't hear you.
Am I audible?
Yeah, it's breaking though.
Okay, sir. I'll try to be louder. Sir, considering technologies like ICT, there's a convergence of technology and military systems as such. So when it comes to Huawei and ZTE, how is these technologies perceived by Global South? Because it is a potential market also, right? So how are other countries perceiving China when it comes to these aspects? And my second question is regarding the alliances only. Are we still looking the concept of alliances and the perception from Western perspective still? Because if we consider China in the present context, it has close relations with Pakistan, Iran, and other countries which are having considerable difference of opinion or difference of ideologies from the West presently. So how does this play in?
Yeah, okay. So I'll take the first question first. Let's understand one thing. The Global South is an expanse which is in transition. There are many countries in the global south that were nobodies, maybe, 20 years ago. Today they are somebodies, or today they are actually, buddies which are taken into account. But there's also a governance problem in many parts of the global south. So there is no uniform global south. There are different global souths within the global south. And the Chinese technological products that basically go out there, I'm talking products because I look at them as commodities, they are seen differently. For example, take Brazil. Now, Brazil is a very important market, and Brazil is to make a very important decision shortly on what is to be done with its 5G and whether Huawei is to be allowed or not. This presents a very big dilemma for policymakers in the global south, because they have to balance, on the one hand, issues of data privacy, issues of civil liberty, issues of democracy. And on the other hand, they also have to balance the economic logic of being able to provide these technological products. Both of these are quite compelling. Both of these in the normal course of events are quite competitive. But the Chinese technological companies are able to make greater headway in those countries where democracy is not at a premium, where civil liberties are not necessarily the basic regard of these countries. Whereas in those countries which have a certain democratic character and need to be able to balance between civil liberties and economic benefits of technology, there it is a very difficult path. So if you look at Chinese headway that China has made, just look at South Korea, for example, look at Southeast Asia. I mean, if you look at the places where China's Huawei has been able to make entry, it's not been able to make entry in Singapore, because Singapore is a highly advanced country, and Singapore is a country which is also very high on the index of innovation. But Chinese Huawei was able to make a lot of headway in Malaysia, because if you see what happened to Malaysia over the last 8 or 10 years, you can see that there was a certain authoritarian tendency that had developed within Malaysia's democracy, where balance of power and filters on democracy had been cast away. Similarly, if you look at Africa, there's been a huge expansion of Huawei's inroads in Africa, because democracy is at a premium in Africa. So the point for the democratic world is, if you want to constrain and not contain China, then there cannot be just a normative argument about democracy or the lack of it. There also has to be an economic argument which is rooted in cost competitiveness and quality of product. So across the global south, when you look at authoritarian tendencies, when you look at authoritarian countries, you see Huawei making very strong inroads. Whereas when you look at countries which are either grappling with democracy, trying to keep democracy alive, or actually are vibrant democracies, they are beginning to now take a fresh look, for example, at what Huawei and ZTE and these kind of companies bring to the table. So it's a bit of a mixed bag right now. But unless the democratic world, and when I say democratic world, I mean, for example, the D10, what was being talked about as the D10, which is the G7 plus, they would have to really rise up to the occasion and be able to provide a credible, viable alternative to products that are brought out by Huawei and ZTE. Otherwise, simply a normative argument will be a losing proposition. With regard to alliances, can you please repeat what you meant by that question, Madhu?
Yes, sir. Sir, when it comes to China's alliances, I had a question, because whenever we see its close proximity with Pakistan and Iran, why aren't we considering them as alliances? Are we still looking the concept of alliances in a Western, lens or a perspective? Because these countries also have a growing nexus, or do you call it growing, similarity in their ideology or something, or against West, that kind of a notion.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, as I said, alliances can be seen differently. For example, if you look at Pakistan, Pakistan is a dysfunctional state. Pakistan is a state which pretty much continues to be a one-trick pony. It basically continues to fuel its anti-Indianism. So any country that is willing to tie up with Pakistan and which is going to allow Pakistan to remain a pinprick for India, Pakistan's game with that. With Iran, it's a very different thing. And I would, here say, look at it more nuancedly. In fact, Iran is going through a very difficult situation right now. One is, of course, the tremendous economic hardships that exist in Iran right now. which is also a consequence of years of sanction in Iran. But Iran is also now trying to balance between remaining in the Russian corner and actually becoming a kind of an alliance partner of China. There's no doubt that China has signaled its $400 billion for 25 years investment deal, which is essentially about infrastructure connectivity through Iran. And they're trying to bring Iran into that particular mix. But when Iran looks at its own alliances, Iran is also good negotiating. Unlike Pakistan, which essentially can be a cat on a hot tin roof, jumping from one side to the other, Iran has been a much smarter negotiator, which knows how to extract maximum bang for the buck from various entities. So in the case of Iran, the alliance that Iran strikes with China is on a very different footing. It is largely to be able to deepen Iran's integration with Central Asia and also deepen Iran's integration with the Chinese BRI, which Iran sees as a very important unlocking of value for itself. But Iran is not going to be a wholesome Chinese ally. Iran continues to be in the Russian corner, and Russia is not very easy with this whole idea of China becoming the big player in the region, which is why you would have seen that it was Russia which pushed strongly for Iran to become part of the SCO, so that it can keep Iran in its own sphere of influence. But Iran is also looking at the West. In fact, if the nuclear deal were to be resumed in some form, as they are now suggesting, then possibly Iran is looking at a lot of Western investment into Iran as well. So Iran will not end up becoming an alliance partner of either China or the West. It will probably use its geostrategic location, the fact that it has basically got both an access to the hinterland, but also an access to the waters or the maritime expanse, to be able to extract maximum leverage from all the sovereign protagonists that matter. But yeah, I would take you up on that this is why I say that, in our writings on alliances now, we have to look at alliances very differently. Alliances build around strategic portfolios. Each one of them will have a very different dynamic to the other. So connectivity pathways have their own ways of looking at alliances. You will have to look at infrastructure corridors very differently to how you looked at alliances. You will have to look even at security alliances very differently. As you rightly said, the latest military power report has spoken about. In fact, they have said that by 2027, China will have a systems of systems approach. And the systems of systems approach essentially means a full seamless integration of technology into military domains, into strategic domains. So it's going to redefine the way you see alliances. Alliances today are no longer only about a submarine here or a submarine there. It's today about how you can, actually be able to straddle the spatial divide between outer space and the deep depths of the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Daksh here has a question. Daksh, please.
Hi, sir. I'm a second year student at the department. I have two questions for you. The first one is, you mentioned that it's a dead hypothesis to even think of isolating China from any sort of globally, right? But then you also see these concepts of China resilient supply chains or China independent supply chains, especially if you look at the Quad Summit, which was like a collaboration of the semiconductors. There's also talks of rare earth supply chains, which are China independent. So how viable are these ideas of China resistance or just resilient supply chains? Secondly, can you also put into context how China's domestic policies, especially regarding its economic models, are changing? Because you see that China is letting all these, first of all, it's clamping down on all these big tech companies. Then they're also letting companies like Evergrande fail. And they're also pushing companies to, contribute more to the society. So do you think that cracking down on the wealth creators of the country will also affect China's capability on how it, carries out economic projects abroad, or does it not have a factor at all?
Okay, I think two excellent questions. So let me take the first one. Look, there is no doubt that the China resilient supply chains or creating manufacturing and production capabilities, which can withstand whatever happens in China, has become the in thing now. But if you look at the language, it's China resilient supply chains. It's not ex-China supply chains. So what is happening here, even if we were to create China resilient supply chains, it is really not an evacuation from China, but actually a relocation of certain strategic assets out of China so as to be withstand any of the downturns that may come from China. So it is implicitly an admission that China continues to rule the roost when it comes to production and manufacturing capacities. And what is being done is essentially to try and insulate companies from a total meltdown in the event China were to fail or certain aspects of China were to crumble. But let me point out the diminishing returns that operate on this kind of a concept. For example, the Indo-Pacific Quad has talked about strategic capacitation through China resilient supply chains. But are Southeast Asian countries on board? In fact, when Japan, Australia, and India put together the SCRI, which is the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, the big issue was, can you bring in the Southeast Asian countries, the ASEAN countries, which are going to be critical in this whole notion of China resilient supply chains. And India is believed to have said no to a Japanese proposal to bring in ASEAN within the SCRI. The reason for that is India has a deep sense of concern about how ASEAN countries have been drawing closer economically to China, so much so that even a Vietnam, which has issues with China in the SCS, but wants to have closer production and manufacturing ties with China because it stands to benefit the most from any relocation of assets from China as a result of the cost of production going up in China. So the beneficiaries of engaging with China outdo those who want to move away from China. And that's happened same with Japan as well. That's happened with South Korea as well. So in this context, that's why I said that the China isolation theory is probably a kind of a red herring. It's not going to happen. But you will see the countries moving away from China where compulsions don't dictate them to engage with China. Therefore, I had used the word when I talked about it. I said India is the preferred, choice, and privileged partner, whereas China is the partner of compulsion. Look at a Germany. A Germany can go nowhere because Germany is the one economy in the European Union. 47% of Germany's GDP is export based. And of that 47%, critical supplies come out of China. No wonder that Angela Merkel and whoever follows, even now when they'll have a new chancellor, will find it very difficult to snap links with China without actually having a blowback on your own self. The same applies to France. 80% of France's supply chains are actually located in provinces very close in Wuhan and around Wuhan. So as a result of that, if you have these big economies which are so integrated with China over the last 10, 15, 20 years, how do you expect them to simply isolate because some political conflict has happened? Businesses don't operate on political conflicts, they operate on bottom lines and margins. Unfortunately, that's the reality. As far as your second question is concerned, I think it's very important to understand that there are some parallels also between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi. When Xi Jinping came to office, the first issue he took up was corruption. Now, I understand that many accuse him of being very selective on that. He used corruption to purge his opponents from within the Communist Party. But be that as it may, it's not totally true. I mean, it's true that he did, victimize his opponents, but he also did go after a lot of black sheep within the Chinese system. As many as 1,400 judges and people within the legal fraternity were sent to jail for corruption across various levels of the judicial system in China. This is very similar to Prime Minister Modi. One of the first things that Prime Minister Modi did after coming to power was to announce a crackdown on corruption. In his first cabinet meeting, the first decision he took was to essentially ask for the accounts of those who had black money out in Switzerland. And the first campaign, even in terms of demonetization, was to crack down on corruption. So there is a tendency to always look at such options because they are politically also very popular. Now with Xi Jinping, if you look at his conditioning and framework, I for one, on the basis of my understanding, do believe he is a combination of both Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. He's Mao Zedong in terms of his desire for total authoritarian control, absolute no room for dissent. And he's doing exactly what Mao Zedong did when the liberation happened, when they went after the elites in China and they purged the elites in China, saying they were the bad people, they were the bad eggs. He's now going after the big businesses, but he's going after them to soften them up. Because if you see the sectors which he has targeted those sector businesses which he perceives are a threat to his own control and the control of the CPC, because these are sectors which have their own independent power wielding ability. The tech companies are always going to be on the anvil of attack because tech companies can have their own ways of influencing public opinion and mobilizing public opinion in a country like China. So going after tech companies was not a surprise. But you have to also understand that when he came into office, initiated a process of consolidation of businesses, particularly state-owned corporations, the big corporations and the smaller corporations, because he recognized the need for regulatory cleanup to happen. There have been many steps taken of regulatory cleanup in the insurance sector, now in the real estate sector, and other sectors, which are essentially being done to take away vested interests and special interests and to be able to put them into a certain degree of financial footing. In this consolidation of corporations, he has succeeded in some places and not in some places, with regard to being able to clean the books of some of their companies. But to your question about whether this is going to kill enterprise in China, I think that is the $15 trillion question. Because a Chinese society, for all its instrumentalized entrepreneurship, is really not a society which is steeped in innovation. It's still a very regimented society where technology development is state-centric and state-driven. It doesn't have the natural innovation that an Indian society has because it doesn't allow for that space for innovation to grow. So this remains a very big question, that if he starts cutting off some of these companies which have done well over the years, it is actually going to be regressive because it will cut off human innovation and basically leave China as only a creature with state-driven and state-centric innovation. And that may not necessarily help China in terms of its technological superiority in the world, but may certainly allow the CPC to remain dominant for the next 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Dattesh. Another question from Ms. Gargi. Gargi, you can ask a question.
So actually, he answered my question. I had the same doubt about his isolationist theory and exceptionalism. So he answered it actually very well. Okay.
There is one more question by Mohemi, Ms. Mohemi. She wanted to ask about your views on B3W versus BRI.
Yeah, I mean, look, B3W is the new kid on the block. It's not even been 6 months since it was announced. But the problem is there have been a lot of such mushrooming announcements in the Western world. And this has been my biggest grouse. If you want to constrain the monstrosity of China, you've got to be serious. You can't be every few months throwing up some of these initiatives in the air like trial balloons, and they basically blow up even before they reach the ground. Cast your mind back to what Trump did. Trump announced Blue Dot Network. Where is Blue Dot Network today? Is the Biden administration talking about it? Is anyone talking about it? Before that, we have had other initiatives. In fact, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which India floated in 2019, is also a very important initiative that should be adopted and be made like a solid strategic initiative. India has proposed through the International Solar Alliance, which Prime Minister Modi repeated again at COP26, which is the one sun, one world, one grid. It's a fantastic concept. It's a concept that can be an absolutely credible alternative to sustainable development and to the BRI. But the problem is there are too many initiatives being floated and not enough institutional support and political leadership support coming behind it. As a result of which, BRI remains the only game in town, and that's the unfortunate part. I, for one, would hope that if not the B3W, some form of the B3W, because B3W at the end of the day is more like a normative statement. It's build back a better world. It doesn't mean anything. It just says we want to build back better. But you have to flesh out what that build back better means. I, for one, think that the Indo-Pacific community, and particularly the Quad, which had a very successful summit in Washington in September, I think the issues that they have picked up, because if you saw the joint statement there, the joint statement did not have mention to the typical issues that Quad addresses, which is about right of navigation and freedom of navigation, overflight rights, etc. They left that out deliberately because that is the argument China always makes, that the Quad is only about containing China. They wanted to send a positive message to the world that come and join with us, because the Quad is not only about containing China, but the Quad is about a positive agenda to build a credible path of sustainable development in the infrastructure domain, the critical technologies domain, the vaccine development and healthcare domain, the climate change and sustainability path domain. All these domains, if they can be developed through the Quad framework, by bringing in Quad plus propositions wherever possible, they can become alternatives to the Belt and Road Initiative. But if it doesn't happen, then you will find that probably 2 years down the line, or maybe 3 years down the line, with a new American president, let's say at some point in time, the B3W will also be forgotten. Also remember one more thing. First, before pushing any initiative, there has to be a full meeting of minds on this issue. At the G7 summit which happened, the B3W was adopted. But look at the differences that cropped up when the B3W was sought to be fleshed out. South Korea, which joined the G7 summit as a plus member, was not willing to sign off on this because they realized that at some point in time, it will become an anti-China bulwark. Same happened even within the European Union itself and within the G7 countries, where Italy, France, and Germany were not wanting to have a strong statement on B3W because they saw that as a clear threat being issued to China, which would have its ramifications for their own interchange with China. So the point is, you need institutional support. You need money where your mouth is. You need to be able to put the finance in place. And I, for one, have huge doubts how much the Americans can run with this, because a country which is in debt of $28 trillion and counting, how is it going to be able to put up this kind of an initiative which requires cash flow when China, when America doesn't have the space even for cash burn? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Okay, I think I'll just have one final question, if it is fine.
Sure.
This is based on, again, your own experiences while visiting China and interacting with the elites. How do you find, or do you find that there is a substantial change in the discourse on India in terms of understanding Indian society, from the range of understanding Indian society to understanding Indian politics and foreign policy? And how is it basically, or is it actually shaping China's policy towards India?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, in fact, to conclude with, because I've had some distinct takeaways on this. There's no doubt that for whatever the Chinese follow, I mean, first of all, let's be very clear. At the popular level, there is not much of an understanding of the ground level realities of India. So that's because the people are not necessarily told about India, because China does not teach India as being somebody that Chinese need to lose sleep over. The whole argument is India is a much smaller power. We have to only be bothered about the United States. So normally speaking, India doesn't figure in that kind of discussion like the United States constantly figures. It's only about the United States. But ever since 2014 and Prime Minister Modi arriving on the scene, they have watched the situation very carefully. And they have realized that India is now beckoning for fundamental change. So they have been forced to sit up and take notice of India for a few things that Prime Minister Modi has done. For one, the whole issue of militarizing, or rather improving the infrastructure on our border areas. This has certainly made the Chinese scholars sit up and take notice and start to look at India for what it is. But I must tell you this, compared to the kind of work that we are doing or not doing on China, they are beginning to look at India in a more granular fashion. For example, I know this from my own contacts. They are developing scholars on India, that means scholars on South Asia and scholars of India, who are being asked to learn the regional languages of India. Now, this is something, I mean, we don't even need to bother about different dialects. Are we serious about getting our China scholars to learn Mandarin? One of the big losses in India has been that everyone wants to mushroom a China, China studies, program, but they don't integrate the Chinese language with China studies scholarship. And until that happens, you will be dependent on just a few scholars who have done the hard work in terms of knowing Mandarin. Now, I was much amazed that not only are they confining themselves to Hindi, but I know of a couple of scholars in China who are South Asia scholars, India scholars, who have learned Marathi because they keep close tabs on what is happening in Maharashtra. And in fact, when a delegation of 17 businessmen came to meet Devendra Fadnavis ji in Nagpur, when he was chief minister, scouting for investment, who was the translator? The translator was not an Indian who knew Mandarin. The translator was these scholars who accompanied those 17 businessmen who were speaking in fluent Mandarin and in fluent Marathi, which surprised even our own people here that, they could speak in Marathi. And I was told this when I tried to investigate, that yes, we are trying to keep very close tabs on what is happening in different states of India, because we have realized that if, of course, this is before the pandemic, when they were looking for investments, we have realized that if you want to engage India economically, you have to engage India at two levels. One is you engage the government at the federal level, but India lives in its states. Ultimately, your investment will either come off or will be unstuck because of the state government. So knowing the state, bureaucracy, knowing the state dynamics is as important as knowing the federal dynamics. So this is one area I found very, very interesting. Second point that I find very interesting, as I'd mentioned to you as well, is the deep interest that they have taken in trying to understand the back end of the BJP's thinking. They have come to admit that, whether BJP is in power or not, this party is going to be a central pole of Indian politics for the next few decades. And if that be the case, there is a need for a deeper understanding, not only at the government to government level, at the party to party level, but also at the back end level. That's why I can tell you, without disclosing too many details, that, there has been a constant endeavor to engage with people in the BJP who are handling foreign affairs or who know the mind of Prime Minister Modi. There have even been some books that have been written on Prime Minister Modi that have been commissioned by the Chinese state, trying to get people to write on Prime Minister Modi, even trying to understand senior ministers in his government. And there has also been a deep attempt to understand the RSS thinking on strategic affairs and foreign policy. So my whole argument is, if this is the level of granular understanding that they want about India, are we doing enough? And if we are not doing enough, I think we are ourselves making a cardinal mistake, because then we are dependent on American literature and European literature to understand China. Whereas I think we are too big a civilization and too important a country not to be able to understand our neighbor through our own devices and through our own mediums. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dattesh. That's very, very fascinating and interesting insights which you have drawn from your own personal visits and personal understanding and inference of the Chinese thinking. So with that, I'll just go to the vote of thanks stage, and I would like to invite Mr. Pritish, who is a first year student of our MA program. Pritish.
Morning, everyone. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks for this special lecture on the topic of perception and misperception in India-China relations. I, on behalf of the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Dattesh Parulekar. We thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule and for sharing your valuable expertise and experience on this relevant topic that has gained momentum in the recent times. It was especially insightful to learn about the complex relationship between India and China that has dictated by the baggage of history, geography, and power asymmetry between India and China, and how India will need to transform its capacities into capabilities which will define the relationship in the next few years. You also said about how China's perception, or rather their misperception of India's rise makes them uneasy. How this misperception is seen by China, and how this misperception China sees India as a Western prop against them. You also spoke about the fundamental differences in the worldviews of China and India. And China's hegemonic exceptionalism versus India's Vasudeva Kutumbakam worldview that enables India to not be hesitant while engaging with the West. I would also like to thank Dr. Anand, our assistant professor, for being our moderator today. And I would also further like to thank Dr. Nand Kishore, the head of the department. I would like to thank the audience both online and offline for their active participation and cooperation. And also I'd like to thank Dr. Anand for designing the poster for this special lecture. Once again, I would like to thank everyone involved in making this special lecture a success. We look forward to more such enriching sessions with you, and hopefully in person. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Nand Kishore and the entire Department of Geopolitics and IR. It's been a pleasure to associate with all of you once again. Hope to someday see you in person sooner rather than later. And it's been a very enriching session for me to share my modest experiences. So thank you once again for Manipal University to invite me. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.